Hi, good evening, everybody. At least good evening if you are where I am, just outside of London. Good, whatever time of day it is, wherever you happen to be, if you're joining us from the four corners of the world. Welcome to this joint event of the King's Russia Institute and the Russian Eurasian Security Research Group in the Department of War Studies here at King's College London. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you to this evening's discussion, or the presentation of an excellent book that we'll get into in a moment. I would like to go ahead and, as long as I understand how this technology works, invite my colleague from King's, Domitilla Sagramoso, and our guest of honor, our speaker this evening, to go ahead and say hi in a moment. Just a couple of notes. This discussion is being recorded. It's being streamed on YouTube. Will be available for posterity. So just as a participant, so you are aware of that. If you do have questions or comments you would like to make, we will get to those in short order, and I'm hoping to get to as many of you as possible. Please do use the Q&A function in your app, in your browser, whatever you're using to connect to this webinar. So having made those preliminaries, I'll go ahead and get started. My name, again, is Sam Greene. I'm the director of the Russia Institute at King's, and as such, a very proud colleague of Domitilla Sagramoso, lecturer in the Department of War Studies at King's, and author of this book, Russian Imperialism Revisited, which is the subject of our discussion this evening. The format will be fairly straightforward and hopefully fairly informal. So I'm going to say a couple of things about the book based on my reading of it, most of them nice, and then ask Domitilla a few questions just to get the conversation started. And then we'll open it up to the rest of you. We have got about an hour and 10 minutes together. So let's not lose any time. I really have three things I want to say about the book, other than the fact that it is timely. And we say that a lot about Russia books. They always seem to be timely. But I think we're at a moment now, given the fact that Putin has just written himself into office potentially until 2036, which is, I suppose, the closest thing we get to perpetuity, right? Given that we're looking at what the aftermath of a U.S. election might mean for relations with Russia, transatlantic relations, and more broadly, we're looking at things like New START, we're looking at Ukraine, we're looking at Syria, we're looking at the West Balkans, we're looking at all these things happening, right? And what we need is perspective, and that, to me, is really what this book is about. And that's why I'm really grateful that it's out now and that we have an opportunity to talk about it. So the first thing to say really is that the book is encyclopedic. Right. Being a Routledge book, it is expensive, right? But encyclopedias are expensive and they're worth it, right? So either get your library to get it or get a copy on your shelf, right? Because it's populated with these short, sharp chapters. And as a result, it's really the kind of thing I think you're going to want on your desk, or not too far from your desk, if you work on Russia or come into contact with Russia, really for some time to come. It's not the kind of book that's going to stop being useful in 6 months or in a year, right? It's going to be the kind of book that's going to be a really authoritative, but concise and well-motivated reference guide to Russian foreign policy, really since the end of the Soviet Union, right? You can replace 6 or 7 books on your bookshelf with this one. In that regard alone, I think really it is a remarkable achievement, and I would like to congratulate Domitilla on that. It's also, I think, remarkable that the book gets you to recognize the complexity and the ambiguity when we're thinking about Russian foreign policy. And I take this to really be the point of the book, right? That we need to get to terms with this ambiguity and this complexity without banging you over the head about it, right? So much of the Russia debate these days really is about banging you over the head with one stick to try to get you to forget something, and then banging you over the head with another stick to try to get you to think about something else, right? And this book does not do that. Right. Domitilla, I think, as an author and as an analyst, really wants to get you to stop believing a lot of things that you probably believe, right? And maybe begin to believe some other things. but the book doesn't harangue you out of your sort of preconceived notions, right? Out of your prejudices and out of your ideas about how Russia and the world works. It methodically, quietly, patiently pulls you out of your comfort zone, right? And forces you to come to terms with the fact that the world and Russia are infinitely more complex than you thought they were, right? It doesn't say controversial things necessarily, right? Which was a little surprising to me coming into it, because I think the title and sort of the packaging let me think that this was going to be more controversial than I found it to be. But that's an achievement, because at the end, right, I think you come out thinking that things that you might not have been willing to countenance as an argument before, right, are now much more intuitive, right? And I think that, again, is a really important achievement. It doesn't say controversial things. It sticks you in the middle of the controversy, right, and forces you to come to terms with it intellectually on your own. If there is a criticism, and of course this is an academic discussion, so there has to be criticism. If there is a criticism, it's that I'm not entirely sure that Domitilla gives us a really good ladder to pull ourselves out of that controversy, right? Or at least I was struggling to find it, right? I understand why we should be there, and I understand why we need a ladder out of it. And I think because I know Domitilla and have had the opportunity to work with her now for a number of years, I think I have a sense of maybe what this ladder should be, right? But that's what I want to talk about now, right? Because I'm not really sure. Well, first of all, what I really wanted to hear, right, as I read the book, was more of Domitilla, right? What I wanted to hear, Domi, was more of your own voice, right? Sort of out loud, front and center, right? Rather than kind of lurking in the shadows, right? So you're there, you're sort of guiding us around, you're putting us in places that maybe we weren't comfortable being intellectually, right? And giving us reason to become more comfortable with them. But it's sort of one thing to sort of see and understand and kind of feel the ambiguity and the complexity, right? And academically, that's incredibly important, right? But if you handed this book to a policymaker, right? So if you took this into the Foreign Office or into the State Department, to the MOD or to the European Commission, right, or the External Action Service, and said, this is what you need to know when you're devising your new Russia strategy, right, which all of them need to do because none of them have a good Russia strategy. I'm not entirely sure what they would make of it, and I'm not entirely sure what they should make of it. If I had to summarize the book for them, I think that's where I would struggle a little bit. So that's where I'd like to start really the discussion, right? Based on everything you've pulled together in this book and everything you've learned over the process of researching and writing this book, which must have been incredibly painstaking. What should policymakers, right, sitting, I'm not going to, what Putin should do is another set of questions, right? But what should policymakers sitting in London or sitting in Washington or sitting in Brussels, right? What do you want them to understand and apply from this?
Yeah, thank you very much, Sam, for your introduction and your comments. I'm very glad that you liked parts of it, and I'm very interested by your comments as well and your criticism. So thank you very much. And I also would like to thank everybody who's here and who's interested in this book, and those who have also helped me to make it happen. So I want to say that at the start, before anyone sort of disappears halfway. So thank you very much to everyone in this conversation. I think you raise a really important point, which is, how would I sort of summarize the main arguments or the main points or the main sort of ideas of this book? And I think that I would just point to sort of three dimensions that generally make Russian foreign policy in this area of the former Soviet space. And that is generally sort of, to a great extent, increasingly a nostalgia for empire or for sort of great power status, and for sort of a very strong bloc, the creation of a strong bloc around the states that are around Russia and used to form the Soviet Union. This also comes hand in hand with often the Russian state operating according to what it considers are its national interests, its legitimate interests. And I think these also need to be taken into account by Western decision makers. And also thirdly, to consider the fact that the actions of the Russian state in this area, they result very much from internal developments in Russia, but also external actions. So a lot of what we do and how we operate have an impact on Russia's operations and actions and behavior in the former Soviet space. So I think that the more I research, the more I notice that these three elements of sort of nostalgia for empire, if one would like to call it like that, concern over national interests, and also reaction to events both internally and externally, kind of shape Russian policies. And these need to be taken into account when devising a policy towards Russia to make sure that there is no sort of jumping into conclusions or, a reaction that doesn't consider all these various elements. And I think it's very hard to know which one is predominant at a particular moment in time. So I think there will be moments when sort of the imperial dimension might be more predominant. There will be moments when actions by Russia would be sort of in reaction to events of neighboring countries, be it China, be it Europe, European Union, be it other sort of Middle Eastern neighbors, or in other opportunities, it might be concerns about domestic developments, for example, concerns about sort of sudden regime change. And I think that was very clear in many instances when we had the so-called color revolutions. So I don't know if that sort of answered slightly your concern and your question.
Well, it does to a degree, and it raises some more things to talk about, which we'll get to. I think one of the things that you just said brings me to something else that I was thinking about, right? And that I think you really bring out quite clearly in the book, right? Which is this, again, coming back to this issue of complexity, right? So the fact that, as you just said, right, it's sometimes difficult to know, which of these tendencies, which of these motivations, which of these factors that plays into Russian foreign policy making is going to come to the fore in a given circumstance. Of course, that makes policy analysis very difficult, right? Because it means that you don't know whether you should be planning for a response based on domestic politics or based on foreign policy. We'll come back to that in a moment, right? But to what extent, as we think about that, right, do we need to break down what we mean by Russia? Right? I think there's a tendency, and I say this as a international relations person, I think there's a tendency in international relations to, as a discipline and as a field, right, to think about states in ways that are monolithic and sort of almost irreducible. Clearly, right, that's not what you're doing in the book. We see these episodes in which all these different actors come into play, right? We see moments in which Gazprom, or even just sort of one conceptualization of what the gas interest might be, come in and drive an aspect of foreign policy, and that irritates other people in the system, who then turn around and push back and do other things, right? And yet from the outside, this all looks like Russia, right? Can help us, sort of break down Russia as this sort of complex, fractious sort of coalition of interests, right? What should we be looking at when we're thinking about, again, understanding whose interests are at play and how they come to the fore when Russia is reacting?
I think. Do I have to unmute?
You're good.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry. I think before I directly answer your question, it made me think of something that I also think is relevant about the book, is that there is nothing sort of inevitable in Russian behavior. And the reason why this book, I insisted so much in covering sort of the 1990s, was to show that sort of the evolution and the changes throughout, and to show that I often came across commentary or books or journal articles which really emphasizes sort of almost inevitability of Russia behaving in an imperialist fashion, almost by the fact that it is, by definition, the hegemonic power in the region, it was bound to operate in a particular fashion. And that's why I thought that it was also important to understand, as you mentioned, sort of the factors that make this change throughout time, and the actors, as you say, that make Russia. Of course, in different periods of Russian history, post 1991, we would have preponderance of different actors. We know now that under Putin, there is much more sort of a vertical of power, especially as far as foreign policy is concerned. But still, there is influence. So we would obviously start by sort of the top leadership around the Kremlin, the people who are influencing or helping the Kremlin and President Putin to take decisions. Those who might have particular interests, especially when we talk about energy. And I cover gas, but of course there is also a very big sort of oil dimension, which is also there, and there are many different energy companies. So these also must be taken into account. The views of different constituencies, for example, the military, the security forces, businesses, I think they all work to a certain extent and influence events. Of course, at the end, there might be a very small group of people making decisions and taking decisions. But it's important also to consider these different actors and how they interact, how they behave, and how they might influence events. It's not always easy because there is increasingly less transparency. So we find it sometimes very hard to understand what is behind each of Russia's decision making. And I think this became particularly prominent in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and sort of the support that the Russian state gave covertly to the rebellion in the Donbass. It was really that was really the moment when I sort of started worrying, really saying, I really don't know who is behind and what influence different actors have. And I really started looking at also another aspect, which I think is very important, which is the role and the power of particular ideas and notions. And I think that in several of my chapters, I discuss the role and the influence of particular notions of how the former Soviet space should be organized. And I think that also is important. And I really want to emphasize this dimension, because to me, what is special about the last 6-7 years is that these sort of ideas of neo-empire, of what Putin often calls a sort of a common civilizational space, which is a sort of a very strong Eurasianist understanding of the former Soviet space, became particularly predominant, together with Russian nationalism and an emphasis on sort of great power aspirations. So the relevance of ideas, I think, also plays a part, as well as an understanding of what, as I said, what could be Russia's sort of main concerns or main interests. So decision makers, when they try to understand how Russia operates, they can look at all these actors, but they can also look at how Russia as a state can operate independently of these actors. There is often the argument that if Putin wasn't in power, Russia would still adopt similar policies. Again, this is partly true. It's not always the case, because I think leaders do play a very important role in driving policy. And in the case of Putin, it was very interesting in 2001 when he accepted or agreed to the American presence in Central Asia, as we all know, against very much the wishes and the desires of people like Sergei Ivanov, who was very close to Putin at the time. So we see how he can sort of navigate the different interest groups or different ideas and sort of impose a decision. But at the same time, I think there are certain kinds of actions which are also, I'm not saying inevitable, but to be expected from any kind of leadership who is in the Kremlin. So I don't know if I answered to your question, but I think that, yeah, it's this combination of actors.
No, it's a lot. It's a lot of food for thought, and I think it makes a lot of sense. Though what we want to be doing is I think focusing on the complexity of it rather than trying to come up with sort of a fixed model of the Kremlin solar system, right? That we look at the changes and we look for the changes if we want to understand what's going to happen next. You talk about reaction, and you talk about reaction to things that happen externally and things that happen internally, right? And I think one of the subtexts of that, and sort of something you just sort of pointed to when you talk about advice for policymakers, right, is to be aware of the fact that a lot of what we see from Russia is in fact a reaction to things that have happened elsewhere, and thus things that we have done, right, things that other governments have done. And with that in mind, I wonder if I can sort of put you on the spot and say, okay, you are a Western government. You've just seen, Navalny has landed in Germany with an evident poisoning, right? I'm not asking you what we should do, right? But what factors should Germany or the US or the UK, right, have in the back of their minds when they're making a decision about how to respond to something like this that happens?
That's a very interesting question, which I have thought a lot about it, even though, of course, I didn't answer it in the book because it's contemporary. Sure. So the question is, how do you advise, and especially, in other circumstances? I mean, do we lift sanctions or not against Russia? I mean, this is sort of an ongoing discussion. And I think that, and you may be surprised by what I'm saying, but I think that although we made many mistakes, I'm of the view that the overreaction of Russia puts us again on the spot, and we can no longer sort of accept or tolerate a particular behavior, even though we might have been the initiators of policies that led to these reactions, which in my view, at this point, I would call overreactions. So we are no longer in the position where we can freely or, with a lot of latitude, decide that we have a great variety of options, because at this stage, I think it would be very risky if we suddenly decided, we're just going to lift sanctions without resolving sort of the Ukraine conundrum and the realities around Donbass, or the problems or the future of, the status of Crimea. So I think that, I mean, my view in general is that we need to remain firm, understanding, what are Russia's concerns, but not sort of deciding that, we are so understanding that we sort of accept a lot of its policies, which are clearly in violation of international law and which have destabilized these European regions and also the South Caucasus regions very much. So as far as, for example, Navalny is concerned, that's to a certain extent also your area of research, because it's very much a sort of an internal domestic question. But again, it's very closely linked to the structure and the nature of the current Russian regime, and to what extent we as sort of Western governments can engage with a Russian government that carries out, if it is proven, I think it's pretty obvious that there must be some kind of involvement by the Kremlin behind, the poisoning of Navalny. So that really raises very serious questions. To what extent we want to engage with a Russian government and a Russian state which carries out these kind of operations. And my answer would be in that respect that, we engage in the areas that we consider are relevant and important to us. And of course, many come to mind discussing the future of what will happen in Belarus, assessing whether we can move forward with a resolution over the conflict in the Donbass. Now, more recently, of course, what can be done about the outbreak of violence and war around Nagorno-Karabakh. Questions over, for example, strategic nuclear arms treaties, but making clear what our red lines are. I think this is where we find ourselves now. Although many of the mistakes were made in the past, I think that unfortunately our room for maneuver is quite limited. And that is why I think it is very important to consider very carefully our actions. And I would argue that now there is a clear understanding that, without sort of fully giving in to Russia, we are learning to also understand that it is in our interest to consider what is Russia's interest in the way they are defining it.
Excellent. You mentioned Belarus and Karabakh, and that leads me on to one more question I want to ask before I throw this open to all of our guests. I see there's a couple of questions that already come into the Q&A, so please do get them ready if you've got them on the tip of your tongue virtually. Looking at what's going on in Belarus, in Karabakh, in Kyrgyzstan, and potentially in other places, what we see, right, what I think we see, right, is a Russia that actually struggles to create outcomes, right? A Russia that has maybe things it would like to see happen in the region. It has outcomes it would like. But it's not able to impose them, right? It's not able to, it has excellent relations, we would think, right, with both Baku and Yerevan, and yet they're not able, with difficulties and differences in both places, right? But yet they're not able to bring them to the table and impose a resolution. They're not able to create an outcome, either with elites in Kyrgyzstan or with society in Belarus. They were singularly unable to do either of those things repeatedly in Ukraine. And so that strikes me as maybe a peculiar kind of hegemony, right? In which Russia is unavoidable and indispensable, and yet in some ways weak, maybe, right? And so I wonder, for those who haven't yet had the chance to read the book, right? If you could talk a little bit about why you think hegemony is the best way to think about Russia in the region now.
Yes, I'm so glad you raised this point, because my conclusion at the very end of it, if the readers want to sort of jump directly to the conclusion, is that Russia in many ways remains an aspiring hegemon. It doesn't always succeed when it tries to sort of recreate, we call it sphere of influence, neo-empire. It's not always very effective. It tries, but it doesn't always get the results it expects. And I think that is clear now when we see the lack of effectiveness in trying to resolve the war in Karabakh. But we also saw that even in Ukraine. Initially it seemed as though Russia was very successful with the annexation of Crimea. It felt as almost not just the Donbass, but an entire chunk of Ukraine could become part of Russia. This sort of famous land corridor towards Crimea. There was also the concern that when the war around Ossetia and Abkhazia occurred in 2008, that in Georgia, that sort of Russia would also sort of move ahead and maybe take over the rest of the country. This didn't happen, but at the same time, it really reinforced the sense of strength, of nationhood among these countries, especially Ukraine. And I would argue that to a certain extent, Russia lost Ukraine. I think this is going to be a question which might not be always answered in one clear direction. I think Ukraine will probably oscillate between Russia and the West for many, many years to come. But certainly we are no longer in a situation where Russia is effective when it tries to operate in the former Soviet space. It wasn't effective in the 2004 Orange Revolution. It wasn't effective in Georgia in many ways. It wasn't effective also when it tried to operate, for example, in Belarus, more recently trying to push ahead for much stronger integration. But it still tries to do that. So to me, Russia remains a sort of an aspiring hegemon, an aspiring neo-imperial power in that area. At least that's the reality of today. It might change in the future again, because I insist, there is nothing written in stone that Russia will always behave in the way it does. But in many ways, and I mean, what my book I try to explain, that's why I go into so much detail, is to show, again, these famous complexities, that it's not either white or black. It is successful in many ways, for example, in creating this, to a certain extent, customs union around the Eurasian Economic Union. It doesn't function very well, but it still functions. Russia managed to establish a common external tariff, relatively, I mean, with hiccups, but there is freer trade than in other regions of the globe, especially in some parts of the former Soviet space. So it does succeed to a certain extent in setting up, at least in theory, a sort of a collective security treaty. We see it doesn't really operate in practice. But at the same time, it deters maybe other actors from operating very effectively in those regions. So while it might not always succeed in restoring an effective bloc, a military economic bloc around its leadership, it also sometimes is able to deter other actors from operating effectively. This varies, of course, depending on which country we're talking about or which circumstance. But at moments it remained effective. And of course, because it proved ready, and this is what sort of became clear as the 2000s progressed, that Russia was ready to use a lot more sort of what I call hard power instruments, intimidation, coercion, use of force. And that sort of allowed it to operate at least theoretically more effectively, or at least for a period of time more effectively. But as you rightly say, I mean, there are strong limitations. And I think these are the ones that the West should consider when it thinks about Russia. Yes, Russia tries, but it doesn't mean it's always effective. It doesn't mean it controls every single actor. If we look, for example, even in Transnistria, it's a very small land part of territory of legally of Moldova with a Russian ethnic Russian minority, and we see that even in the early 2000s, Putin was not able to sort of orchestrate a change of leadership or ensure that the government followed on the desires of a negotiated outcome. And even the Cossack Memorandum, which was signed in 2003, started much more along the lines of what Moldova wanted, and then ended up much more along the lines of what Transnistria wanted. And that was also why the Moldovan government had difficulty in making it acceptable to the population and also to the West. So again, there is not this sort of overpowerful person in the Kremlin able to determine all the destinies in the region.
Fair enough. So we've got a bunch of questions that have come in. So I'm going to sort of move through them as best I can. Right. First, actually, is from our King's colleague Gulnaz Sharafudinova, who congratulates you on the book. And says this: you mentioned the role of ideas, right? And my question, or her question, right, is: are there any new ideas, right, that have emerged as motivating and guiding in Russian foreign policy that cannot be traced back to nostalgia or to the Soviet past, right? That are have their origins within the last 10 years or within the sort of the Putin period.
There is a very interesting idea, which I make a parenthesis. Generally, those who studied sort of Russian-European relations or Russian-Western relations, we know that ideas have generally oscillated between those who have been more favorable towards closer ties with the West, the so-called Westernizers, and those who have been more favorable towards a more sort of nationalist or Slavophile tendency of internal development and looking not necessarily at Asia, but at this sort of Eurasian space where Russia is predominant, and this idea that Russia is almost like a continent on its own in terms of its relations with the peoples of Europe and Asia. And these ideas, which rightly are sort of have their origins almost in the sort of 18th century, 19th century, and of course in the 20th century as well, have manifested themselves in different ways. And more recently, since the mid-2000s, the sort of the imperial notions have become predominant. And this was also something very interesting to discover and to understand, how the notion of empire was seen in under positive light. There were many of those who argued that, even those on the more liberal side, we know famously Chuba is talking about Russia as a liberal empire, potentially as a benign force. And those, on the more conservative side, talking about Russia as sort of orthodox civilization and as a leader of an orthodox space or orthodox empire. So there are varieties over these same themes. What I find very interesting is an idea which, in a way, I haven't really explored in detail in the book because it's part of my next book. And that is the notion of Yevrovostok, which means European East. And that is an idea which emerged in the mid-2000s after the sort of the disappointment of events in Ukraine. In the mid-2000s, the Russian leadership, many of the elites felt that Russia was to a certain extent kind of helping and subsidizing Ukraine. It was trying to develop economic ties. It wasn't behaving particularly assertively from their point of view, although it was clear it had intervened in the elections in 2004, very clearly on the side of Yanukovych. But the perception among Russians was, in the elite, was that Russia had to come with new ideas, that the sort of idea of soft power and a power of attraction had to be particularly sort of developed. And figures around, for example, Lev Pavlovsky, whom I'm sure you know, started really discussing this idea of a European East, also in a way to challenge the predominance of the European Union as an actor in the European continent. Now, what was peculiar about this idea of Yevrovostok was the idea that sovereignty was particularly relevant. And that this sort of postmodern notion of supranational institutions, of handing in part of our sovereignty to new institutions, which is at, sort of lies at the heart of the European Union, was not really favorable to countries in the European East. And so Russia was really trying to come up with an alternative, effective idea, and sort of a notion, a concept that could attract countries in Europe, in sort of in the lands in between the European Union and Russia, around sort of its leadership. And I often argue that these ideas have become extremely powerful and relevant. And today they are embraced by many countries in Eastern Europe, most notably, as we know, Poland, Hungary. So these countries who find it very hard to sort of think in so-called what we call postmodern terms in terms of statehood and sovereignty. In my view, what is interesting is that this idea, emerged quite early in Russia, already in the mid-2000s. So that's one of the new ideas that I think are relevant. I hope I didn't take too much of my time.
No, I'm slightly tempted to put the UK in that same basket, but that's another conversation.
Yes.
So sticking with this idea of empire, right? We have a number of questions that sort of dance around this. So I want to see if I can combine them together. One from Jeffrey Hosking, we have a very distinguished group with us this evening. He says, I notice you distinguish nostalgia for empire from national interests, right? How do you distinguish imperial or geopolitical interests on the one hand and national interests on the other? In the same vein, let's see, where did it go? In the same vein, Lyudmila Ivakina asks, to what extent sort of this imperialist policy or sort of imperial nostalgia, right, is a matter of Putin's leadership and personality and maybe his personal ambitions, right? Or is this something that you would attribute more to sort of underlying factors within within Russian society? And if so, sort of which of these two factors you would see as decisive? And then the third thing on the same theme, right? Sorry to throw this all at you, but I think that they're all related. Is actually from I'm very happy to see a Russia Institute graduate, Rokas Slevitskas. I've never been able to pronounce your name, Rokas. I'm sorry. Who says you mentioned that foreign policy, can be shaped in reaction to events, including from a sense of imperial nostalgia, right? Putin's understanding of the Eurasian way of things, right, for the benefit of important actors and so on, right? A lot of this, he says, has, particularly maybe this nostalgic element, this imperial element, has emotional foundations, right? So what would you take to be the balance in Russian foreign policy between sort of emotional behavior and more systemic, or what we might think of as sort of material, rational behavior? So easy questions.
Thank you. I'm very glad Jeffrey's here because he was one of my PhD supervisors. So thank you, Jeffrey. And I thought very much about you while I was preparing for today's talk, because actually when I was a student, Jeffrey and I, we were discussing sort of this challenge for Russia to actually emerge as an effective nation state. And we often talked about how sort of the evolution of the Russian state in modern times came hand in hand with sort of imperial formation. So Russia, to a certain extent, developed a contiguous empire, as opposed to other Western countries, which, for example, in the 19th century, developed an overseas empire. Russia's empire was primarily colonization and conquest of lands that were surrounding it. So as a result, this idea of empire and state and nation state became very much intermingled, and it was very hard for Russians to think of their state as primarily a sort of a nation state, even a sort of a multi-ethnic state where Russians are predominant. Especially because, as we know, during imperial times, Russians were not even often in a majority. So these complexities, I think, are there, and were particularly there when the Soviet Union collapsed. It was really not clear how the Russian elites and influential constituencies would understand what is Russia. Where do their borders lie? How far should it expand? Especially because at the time there was also concern that the Russian Federation would disintegrate in turn. So and there was a lot of concern about the fact that many areas where there was ethnic Russians or Russian speakers had ended up in northern Kazakhstan, had ended up in Ukraine or Belarus, and that other areas which were had been incorporated into the Russian Empire much more recently, for example, the North Caucasus, with populations that were culturally much more diverse, Muslim primarily, with different traditions, and which had generally looked more towards Iran, Persia, the Middle East, or Turkey. I think this debate about what is Russia, where should the borders lie, has never really been resolved. And that is why I think this imperial idea sort of persists, because I think in the mind of many Russians, it's still very hard to see countries like Ukraine or Belarus as entirely foreign. I think in the same way as it would be for the UK to see Scotland, if it ever there is a sort of a decision to go ahead and the referendum would result in a call for independence. I think that the ties, the personal ties, the economic ties are particularly relevant. And that brings me to my second point. I think the national interests or the interests of Russia are related primarily to all these legacies of empire that bring these regions closely together. And they range from economic ties. I mean, there is a very strong rationale for preserving a common economic space, potentially a customs union, because there is a lot of interaction and a lot of sort of so-called supply chains within this space. There are also arguments in favor of military cooperation to address, for example, conflicts that occur around the borders. Now, of course, there is the argument to what extent Russia may have actually participated in sort of exploiting these conflicts. But I mean, that's a long discussion. But still, I think there is an argument that you know, there is a joint benefit by this cooperation, and therefore there is an interest in Russia. It is a legitimate interest to sort of try to make sure there is no instability along its borders. Whether it is imperialist or not, I think Russia would always operate trying to put an end to violence in areas that are neighboring its borders, if only because of instabilities that it faced itself, specifically in the North Caucasus. And I think that what was often not considered or understood was how relevant the North Caucasus, how relevant Georgia was for the operations that Russia was conducting in the North Caucasus. And this was also something I discovered when I was writing my book. You know, how much Georgia became relevant to Putin in the early 2000s, primarily because of the war that Russia was conducting in the North Caucasus around Chechnya. So I think that there is this interaction between what is a concern by Russia over its economic well-being. Secondly, for example, the ability to continue exporting not only its main trading commodities such as oil and gas, but any other kind of product through countries such as Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine. I think that the concern that Russia might that the transit of these products might be in jeopardy as a result of the actions of Ukrainians or Belarusians is an issue of concern, imperial nostalgia sort of notwithstanding, okay? So I think this would always be there. I don't know if I've answered the question. So I think that there will always be these sort of underlying elements that are present, whether Putin is in power or not. I mean, and I think the question of energy transit lies at the heart of many of the decisions of Russia to sort of try to acquire shares or full control over pipelines or storage facilities, you name it. So because of the new nature of the Russian state, by definition, I think Russia was going to operate actively in these regions. To what extent are these reactions to emotions? I think it depends very much on whom we are talking about. I think for the Russian man in the street, you know, the emotional significance of Crimea was fundamental. I mean, I think we all have anecdotes of, you know, my travels in Russia after the annexation of Crimea and the sort of the exhilaration of people ready to forgive Putin almost anything because he had brought back Crimea to the motherland. And many of my Russian friends, they would just mention it as a return of Crimea to the motherland. So the emotional dimension on the personal level and matters that relate to Russian minorities and the well-being of Russian minorities, I think is particularly relevant. And when I discuss this with my colleagues in Moscow, you know, I always ask them, to what extent, you know, Putin really cares about, you know, Russians living in Transnistria or in the Donbass or in other areas where they could be potentially under threat. And you know, the answer is always, you know, there is a limit of what Putin can do. We can't just let them go. So there are pressures that also come from below, although, you know, Putin can be seen sometimes as a rational actor, but I'm of the view that he's not always a very rational actor. And I think if we look, I mean, as some of you might know, a lot of my work was around the North Caucasus. And I think that there, the behavior of Putin was very much based on emotions as well. And we know so many of his commentary, which was sometimes quite rude, really indicated that, you know, when certain points are touched, you know, they touch a particular nerve, he really reacts on emotions. So I think that it's a difficult combination. It's very hard to know at what point what is more relevant. And I think it was particularly clear when after the annexation of Crimea, there was concern that emotionally the Russians would be sort of carried away and push all the way through then the neighboring regions of the Donbass, all the way to Kherson, maybe even Odessa, and maybe even take Transnistria. So certainly, I think the emotions are there. They're sometimes very difficult to entangle, like in any other discussion. I mean, I think we live in the UK, we know the emotions that Brexit can cause as well. So I don't think it's peculiar of Russia.
Certainly. Okay, so I want to come back to this issue of policy and application. So James Nixie, our friend over at Chatham House, right, says he takes the point, right, that we need to understand what's shaping decision making, right? But he wants to push you a little bit further to talk about how what this means in practice and how it can be translated into policy making. To put maybe a sharper point on that, there's a couple of other questions. One from Tony van der Toit in the Netherlands, who asks whether Russia, and you talk about overreaction, right? Whether Russia is gradually turning into a rogue state, right, with respect to international law and its international relations, whether or not this suits the Kremlin, right, or whether or not there are still some rules that we should expect them to see as valid, right, or sorry, some rules that you think that they do accept as valid. And then Anna Maria Bulescu, another King's grad, PhD grad, asks, also congratulating you on the publication of the book, asks what this looks like, not from the perspective of Moscow or Western governments, but from the perspective of other governments in the region, right? If you are Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, right, where does this leave you in terms of your options, the choices that you have in terms of dealing with Russia? Right? Okay, how can they still exercise some independent agency? She asks in their dealings with Russia. I think that's enough for one bundle.
Thank you. I'm going to start by the question about rogue. You know, to what extent Russia has become a rogue state. I think that certainly, again, starting in 2008. With the war in Georgia, Russia clearly violated international law, and not only sort of intervened, as we know, it declared or recognized independence of these small separatist regions or republics, but it also sort of didn't agree to sort of the agreement that had been reached with Sarkozy and and President Medvedev at the time, in terms of what was actually the required withdrawal of Russian forces. So. And also, of course, after 2014, clearly with the annexation of Crimea, Russia becomes a sort of a revisionist state. It's no longer a conservative power, eager to recognize, at least officially, the borders of the countries of the former Soviet space. It seems ready to move ahead and redesign borders. And the question is, again, I mean, was it ready to sort of recreate this sort of imperial space? I'm of the view that today Russia is a bit more cautious. We are really in the realm of of trying to predict. I mean, to what extent would Russia behave in similar fashion? I think that this is my own intuition, but I think that the reaction of the West, especially after Ukraine, the events in 2014, it was slow, it was not always very coherent, but once it was set, it was difficult to remove the sanctions. I mean, and it's not going to be easy. And in America, many of the sanctions have sort of congressional sort of approval. So I think that is, I'm of the view that sanctions do have an impact. They mark a particular line. And so I think Russia will think twice before it sort of decides to launch sort of an adventure again in Ukraine. Unless it feels that its interests, whether we like them or not, I don't know how we want to call them, but from their point of view, it's in sort of their strategic interests are at stake. When we talk about Russia's strategic interests, Russia tends to think of its country as needing and requiring strategic depth. So this idea that it needs sort of a belt of countries around it that is supportive or that is sort of allied to itself to feel particularly safe. And so, of course, this undermines the sovereignty of countries in the neighborhood. And it certainly creates difficulties. But for example, if we would, I wouldn't be surprised that something would happen if suddenly in Belarus there is a very strongly pro-Western leadership and pushing for the kind of path towards European integration as Ukraine did, that Russia would just say, well, that's wonderful, just go ahead. So I think that then we would again see this sort of rogue behavior. Now that puts, that's the last question of the group, which puts us in a very difficult position because we want to uphold our values, our principles, and especially as far as Belarus is concerned, this. We all strongly, and I myself as well, support this idea that Belarusians should choose their own path. And if that path leads them towards closer ties with the West, they should be to a certain extent supported. But if the support results in them losing chunks of their territory, in war, in instability, and then I'm not sure it's really worth it. It's terrible to say because I don't think that that's the path that we would want for these countries. But this is a reality that they may face. Now, I think that therefore, countries in Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, they have a limited room for maneuver, and that's why going back to how effective Russia is, in that respect, Russia is quite effective in making it clear that there is a limit to how far they can go away from Russia. Now, if I want to be more hopeful, I think things could change if someone else was in the Kremlin. I don't think this is absolutely inevitable. And I think that agreements could be reached on the future of these countries. And it is a risky path to sit down and discuss what should happen with the countries in between. But I think it would be an interesting first step. How do we address the security and the stability of countries that are between Europe and Russia? And how do we make sure that their desires and interests are upheld, but at the same time, there is no instability and the interests of the neighboring countries, be it the European ones or the Russian ones, are taken into account. And also what often happens, and it's often not really considered, and that of course doesn't apply necessarily to Georgia, but it certainly applies to Moldova. It does apply to Ukraine, and I suspect it probably will eventually also apply to Belarus, is that there are constituencies in these countries that favor strong ties with Russia. And these constituencies are also part and parcel of the states themselves. And so there is this constant sort of movement in one direction and then the opposite one. And we see that with Moldova now, so, this sort of shifting in one direction or the other. And of course, the Kremlin exploiting these pro-Russian sentiments. So I think that, there are many actors in play and it is not always clear how it will go. I would like if you can repeat again the question by James Nixie, because I would love to answer and I want to understand exactly what he was asking me.
Yes, if I can find it. So James asked, says, first of all, congratulations, amazing achievement. You mentioned that we need to understand Russia's concerns, right? But I don't know what this means in practice, right? So how do you translate it into policy? I think you did.
Okay.
Answer it.
I don't know. I hope James, this is sufficient as an answer. I'm happy to.
You can put a follow-up in the chat, although we are beginning to run short on time. There are a lot of really good questions here that I would love to get to. We're not going to get to all of them. Christine Cheng in War Studies picks up on this issue of inevitability or the lack of inevitability, right? And asks whether or not there's a good example of sort of a fork in the road kind of moment, right? Where things could have gone differently. You pointed to 2008 at one point when Russia made a decision, right, to go into Georgia, right, and that's created sort of a path of then responses and actions. But is there a fork in the road in terms of decisions that Western governments might have made differently that would have landed us in a different place than we are now?
Well, of course, again, we always return to, Georgia 2008, there was sort of the promise of membership that I think was written on the wall, that Russia was going to react. It said it loud and clear. I mean, again, we can argue that these countries have every right, and I support that, but unfortunately, it results in a very negative predicament for them. So it's good to consider that when we take these measures. I think, of course, the other sort of moment was the 2013 debates and discussions over the signing by Ukraine of the EU association agreement. And there was a very strong reluctance at the time by European countries to even discuss with Russia what would be the implications if Ukraine became an associated state of the European Union, and with the implications in terms of trade. And I think there, for example, if we had just sat down to understand that, yes, Ukraine has every right, and it's probably, pro-Europeanists like myself would argue that it could eventually be a very positive development for Ukraine to reach European standards in its internal and economic development or internal regulation. But at the same time, understanding that that would have implications for Russia. And maybe, now I'm going very technical, but when you talk, for example, about questions over the rule of origin, it would have required that Russia maybe set up more effective border posts, check questions of origin, where they were coming from. And that was costly. And if we had maybe sat down and said, we understand your concern, we are ready to help you, we are ready to pay and to sort of carry the burden of the investment that might cost in order to keep you within our project. Now, many would have argued, Russia is a very rich state. It has necessary resources to implement on its own all these necessary customs mechanisms. But I think it would have been sort of a show of goodwill. And I think what often happens with Russia, and again, it doesn't justify their actions, it explains them. So often what I'm trying to do is to explain, not necessarily to justify. It explains many of Russia's actions, this perception that there is no concern at all over the fate of Russia, Russian speakers, minorities, their interests, and a sense of them being humiliated. And I think this is also the topic of my second book, hopefully, on this question, which is the question of minorities, for example, in the Baltic states. Now, it's also a very complex question because we consider also that the Baltic states wanted to build their own statehood and how important it was to have a cohesive population. But again, the treatment of Russian minorities was really not very positive and not to the benefit of Russians or Russians living there. So I think if we took an approach where we consider, and we show that we care. That was a phrase that I learned in Russia on a different context regarding the new Russian leadership. I said, at least in the Soviet times, they pretended that they care. With the new leadership, they don't. But that's a different context. But I think this perception that we care and we understand and we are ready to take you on board. And the same would apply, in many other regions where Russia may have particular interests. We haven't talked a lot about Central Asia, but one of the questions that I think, or the Caspian, that was relevant and valid to consider is the question of to what extent a lot of investment that the Soviet Union had made in many of the fields in the gas and the oil sector, gave Russia to a certain extent potentially a stake. I mean, then, when the negotiations carried forward, there was an understanding. But I think this sort of accommodation, I think would be more effective. It might not necessarily be according to what we believe should happen, but maybe the results would be more effective.
Okay, with that in mind, actually, Oscar, one of our current master's students, says that he takes the point, right, that mistakes have been made along the way, and that a lot of times people have failed to take these sorts of things into account. He mentioned sort of the example of successive U.S. administrations, attempting to sort of reset or improve bilateral relations, and then always within a short period of time ending up at quote unquote the lowest point since the Cold War. It seems like this has happened repeatedly. If you had to give some advice to the Biden administration, what would it be?
I make a small parenthesis. Another point, for example, I was very surprised, was in 2000, from 1990 to 2001, when Russia was trying to address the question of fighters that were crossing onto Georgia. The American government was very, very tough on Russia, saying, you can't operate on the Georgian border, you can't go beyond, and this really irritated Putin. I think, then they sort of got along with Bush. But this was a moment when there was a perception that, are you on the side of the jihadists? Why aren't you helping us to catch them on the other side of the border? And, here something could have been found. Eventually it was found, and there was an agreement that was reached between Shevardnadze and Putin on operating really on the border zones. But I think America could have operated in a much more sort of nuanced and refined manner, rather than just openly arguing that any kind of operation across the border was a massive violation of international law. And, when at that time in particular, there wasn't really an interest to occupy Georgia. So this is again a parenthesis on areas where, slowly coming to mind where the West could have, behaved differently. I think that the answer to this question depends a lot on another big actor, which is, what does the United States want to do with China and with Europe? And to what extent is the United States ready to engage more in Europe, consider European interests, and support Europe in its efforts to resolve conflicts in this neighborhood? So I would argue that we need a lot more stronger engagement in sort of what I would call the wider European space, and that also includes the Caucasus, and support for many of the initiatives that are taken by Europeans. And this, I think, is particularly the case, especially when we think, for example, around the war in Karabakh. I mean, I'm of the view that now we really need to rein in Turkey, and that would be very helpful if, for example, the Biden administration was a bit tougher on Turkey and Turkey's actions in that specific area, as well as in others. But this is our area of focus. So I think that a stronger engagement would be helpful. I think that in that respect, trying to engage and find sort of common avenues of cooperation, as I mentioned, resolving issues starting from issues what we call sort of strategic stability, all the treaties that disappeared, that were signed in the 80s and 90s that really provided the rock bed of our strategic stability in the European continent. They're disappearing one after the other. And I think we really need to sit down again and slowly build these treaties, these institutions again, and restore trust. So that, I think, would be very relevant. And I'm sure the Russians would be very keen to sort of engage. It will not maybe be an easy negotiation, but I think it's an important starting point. Of course, there is the question of China and how America wants to engage with China. There's a lot of talk in America that Russia should become an ally in its struggle against China. I really don't see any future in that on that front. So yes, again, I think engaging, but keeping very clear our red lines.
Great. We've got about 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask one last question from Professor Malcolm Murfitt, who says that he's aware that you had to leave a lot out of the book because of the length of the manuscript. This is always a struggle, right? So what do you most regret not including in the book?
Excellent. Thank you for that question, because then, it provides my door to the next. I mean, this was a huge project, and I have, in a way, 2 books almost in the pipeline, which need just a bit of updating. But the areas that I regretted, there are 2 areas that I regretted, and in a way they form the basis of my next books. One is to really go into a lot more detail into how Russia operated in the military conflicts, especially in the 1990s. I did a lot of research that for my PhD, and I couldn't put it all in. I really went into a very minute analysis, almost on a daily basis, of what was happening in terms of how Russia operated when these conflicts broke out, especially when, of course, Georgia, Ossetia, Abkhazia, Moldova, Tajikistan. So that was an area that was really sad for me to have to leave aside, because it really was part of my original research. The other area that I'm going to explore again in greater detail is the question, as I said, of Russian minorities in countries like Ukraine or the Baltic states, where I also did quite a lot of research on specifically on how Russia operated, for example, in Crimea during the 1990s, but also, in the Donbass in 2014. I really sort of looked in greater detail at the various actors, their backgrounds, where they came from, what was their connection to Russia. So that was a lot of work I did, and I couldn't really include, and I couldn't really develop sufficiently in the way I would have liked, a lot of the ideas behind, the Novorossiya project, but I thought that, there was so much there that it was worth sort of writing maybe a new book. And that's why the last chapter is a bit smaller than the rest, because it's an invitation to the reader to eventually, hopefully, buy my next book if I ever get it published.
Well, we will look very much forward to that. In the meantime, please do go find this book online in the library. Encourage your university library, your institutional library to get a copy if they haven't done so already, or to subscribe to it electronically so you can read it online. I will make one quick announcement, which is that we'll be back in just a couple of weeks' time, or maybe 3 weeks' time or so, with another book presentation. Gulnaz Sharafudinova, my colleague in the Russia Institute, has a new book out called The Red Mirror, looking at some similar issues in terms of the role of identity and security in Russian politics, but from more of a domestic angle. So we will continue this conversation. We will look forward to those 2 or 3 new books and to seeing where this research goes. Please join me in thanking Domitilla for this conversation and for this book. And thank you to all of you for being with us this evening. There are a number of questions, really good questions we didn't get to, as well as some praise. So what I will do, I've copied them out of the Q&A. I will send them to Domitilla after this, so that hopefully you can get a response down the line. But in the meantime, have a good evening, have a good weekend, and hope to see you all again soon, one way or another. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. If I may, again, thank very much, Sam, for hosting this event. It's a real pleasure to speak to you and to everybody who participated. And also, really, I say it all the time, the Department of World Studies and my professors at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, who were my supervisors, they were really special, and they really supported me all along the way. With a lot of patience. And of course, my publishers, Routledge, I mean, they also had to wait many years. So I would like to thank them again very much. So thank you so much, Sam. And yes, I will attend your next event as well.
Thank you.